In this series, we've been talking about a variety of important relational aspects or characteristics in relationships amongst ourselves and relationship with God as well. And so we've talked about don't forget to laugh. Don't forget to call home or stay connected. Don't forget to forgive. Now that's a tough one for many of us, of forgiving and forgiveness. And that's a message that we need a reminder of quite often, the need to forgive. Last week we talked about saying thanks, being thankful. Today we're talking about generosity, giving generously. And I'd like to ask for your help this morning to begin this sermon. I'd like to ask, and you can call this out, I'm going to try to write it down here. What are some things that we can give generously? What do I have that I can share? What do you have that can be freely given, or maybe at cost, but what do you have that we could share or give away generously? A smile. A smile. Time. That's a big one. Enthusiasm. A spare room. Thanks. Give thanks. Anything else? Talent. I heard love. Casey mentioned that as well. Passion. Money. Food. Empathy. Clothes. Comfort. Knowledge. How about hugs? Okay. That's quite a lot of things that we can share, that we can give generously. And much of this, when you look at it, except with maybe a few exceptions, all it requires on our part is effort. The willingness to give something away, to share generously, to bless someone who is in need of a blessing. So I'm going to leave this list up here. On the back of your bulletin is an area for notes. If you feel so inclined to make your own notes in the midst of this message, or to share or write down some of what we have talked about here, please do so. We have a lot of things that we can be generous with. One thing that we didn't mention, but that comes to mind for me, is toys. If you've had children or grandchildren, we tend to accumulate a lot of toys. And we had a practice for a while, I don't know if we've fallen away from it or not, but in order for Gracie to get more toys, we had to take her good toys, so the nicely used toys, and give them away before she could have more. Are there some things that we shouldn't give away? A cold. Do you know anyone who is generously overly generous with their opinion. And you sometimes wish they wouldn't share so freely. Let's think materialistically just for a moment. As a country, a society, a community, and people, we are affluent, especially compared to much of the rest of the world. We have one of the top economies in the world. Our cultural imprint spans the globe. We are culturally and racially diverse. We have been shaped by large waves of immigration from Europe and Africa and Asia and South America and Mexico and other parts of the world. American literature, arts, music reflect a rich heritage of the people. We're the birthplace of jazz. Louis Armstrong, one of the world's most recognized, admired musicians, African American, wonderful jazz musician. Amen. Prize-winning Jewish writers Saul Bellow and Philip Roth are some of the best-known literary figures in the U.S. and in the world. Our media industry has a worldwide audience. We have some of the best, some of the top universities in the world, Harvard, MIT, and of course UW. Go Badgers. And we by no means have it all, which is a platitude that is sometimes thrown around. We have a lot of room to improve our racial relationships, equality between men and women, education for our children, care for our elderly, shelter for the homeless, care for those who struggle with emotional and mental illness, insurance provided for everyone. There's room for growth, even in our own areas of faith. Our relationship with God, there's room to grow. But however we choose to look at it, we have a lot to be thankful for and a lot to be generous with. When we look around compared to many in the world, we have a lot. And there's two basic scriptural principles that undergird all that we have. The first is that everything you have ever had or will have belongs to God. We are managers of God's stuff, stewards of what we have been blessed with. This is why we use the word stewardship when we're doing our stewardship campaign. Or we make our pledges for tithing. We define how much we're going to give back in thanks for God's blessing to help others come to know Christ better, or maybe to be introduced for the very first time. The definition of stewardship can be very simply defined as utilizing and managing all resources God provides for the glory of God and for the betterment of God's creation. Psalm 24:1 reminds us, the earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants too. We are the Lord's. The Bible teaches that my things aren't really my things. They're owned by God, given to me to be used, to be a good steward of. 5 or 6 years ago, there was a gentleman, his name was Jim, and he took me pheasant hunting at a private club. He was one of my church members. He was fairly wealthy, and after we were done shooting and we were walking back to the lodge, he said, Pastor, I have to tell you, I'm a little bit perturbed at you. Well, our guns were emptied by that time, so I was okay. We had just finished our stewardship campaign. Now, Jim was fairly well off, fairly wealthy. And he told me as we were walking back in knee-deep snow, he said, I've worked hard for my money. And it seems like you've been saying that I shouldn't have this money. I thanked him for sharing his thoughts with me. And then said, no, not at all. That's not what I'm saying. Having money and possessions and things is not a bad thing. It's more about what we decide to do with what we have. If our definition of stewardship is utilizing and managing our resources that God provides for the glory of God and the betterment of God's creation or kingdom, then we have to ask ourselves, am I doing what God has asked of me? Am I using my things in a godly fashion? Is what I'm doing for the glory of God or for the glory of me? Does what I have and is what I'm doing for the betterment of God's kingdom? John Wesley said, we ought to gain all that we can gain, but this it is certain we ought not to do. We ought not to gain money at the expense of life, nor at the expense of our health. And so there are limitations there. We don't gather material things or money or wealth at the cost of our own health, the cost of our relationships, the cost of our life. He goes on to say, having first gained all you can, and secondly, saved all you can, then give all you can. Let me provide some context around that, as we are not necessarily called to give away absolutely everything. So now I'm out on the street corner because I've got no place to live, because I gave it all away and I couldn't pay my bills and I couldn't pay my insurance. And so my daughter got sick and I couldn't do anything because I had given it all away. That's not it. That's not it at all. Because if I go that far to that extreme, I'm no longer able to help anyone else, to give anything else. So there is a modicum, a measure of common sense in the midst of that. Think of it this way. Our purpose for having things is to be a funnel of God's blessings. God pours it in on the top, and it comes out, this is going to sound kind of bad, but it comes out the bottom, and we share that blessing. We are a source of God's blessings to the people around us. And that message is often why in my prayer time I say, God, bless us that we may be a blessing to the people around us. 1 Timothy says, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, for the heavens, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. When we are God's funnel, we are storing up our treasures in heaven. Sometimes that means we do sacrifice here on earth. Our true reward is not found here on earth. It is in our everlasting relationship with God. This brings me to the second basic scriptural principle that undergirds what we're talking about, giving generously, sharing generously. God never said that wealth is evil. God never said that having things is sinful. 1 Timothy 6:10 tells us the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's the love of those material things. It's the placing of those material things before everything else. Maybe at the cost of my own health or the health of my family or my relationship with my lovely wife. What Timothy is telling us is that when you love money more than you love everything else, even God, you're placing that idol of money before God. You're no longer being a good steward of what God has blessed you with. So our question isn't how much do I have? We could have a lot, like my friend Jim, or we could have a little. The true question is, how am I using what I have? Am I being a good steward? One of the things that God insists upon is that we are generous people. Please understand that God wants us to live in a constant state of generosity. God doesn't want you just to be generous to the church, although He's not going to argue with you if you are. You're to be generous with your neighbors, to be generous with the community, to be generous with people who don't know God, who don't know Christ, who don't have a relationship with Christ, so that they can look and say, wow, that's awesome. I want to be like you. Why are you so generous? Tell me more. And our generosity isn't relegated to just financial, just monetary means. There's a whole list of things here that we can be generous with that reflect the characteristics of God. We say, I want to be more like Christ. Look at this list. Is there anything on this list that Jesus was not generous with? I don't think so. Maybe a spare room, because He really didn't have His own house. He traveled. He was a wanderer, and other people put Him up. Jim and Diane, this is another Jim, are retired, and they both had very lucrative careers. And after they retired, they wanted to give something back. They wanted to do something. So they began this mission outreach called Feather a Nest, which specializes in furnishing bare apartments that have been recently rented by people who are transitioning out of homelessness. Over the past year, in 1 year, they have helped to decorate 48 apartments with donated items, some of it theirs. And they say, we hope to furnish homes with hope and dignity. And so here, and this is from their website, this is Brooks' family, Brooks' children's bedroom. This is what they had. Yeah. No beds, no dressers, nothing on the walls. And this is after. Wow. Through the generosity of those who gave of their stuff. This is Jessica's home before on the left and after on the right. You notice none of that's extravagant. None of that's like I'm walking into a $5.6 million home. But it's comfortable, it's good, it's nice for the children, for the parents. They've decorated 48 apartments and homes for people that had nothing or very, very little. And through that generosity, they offer dignity and respect and hope. Proverbs reminds us that those who give generously will receive more. And this isn't a lottery ticket kind of investment where I give $1 and I get a ticket back and I won $5 million. It's a guarantee from God that when we give from the heart, when we give graciously and generously, we will be blessed. I spoke with Jim not too long ago, and he said, it's been a lot of hard work at times, but rewarding doing God's work in a needy area. And they work primarily in downtown Milwaukee. A lot of hard work, but so rewarding. They are blessed through the ministry that they are doing. And while the worldview on stewardship might be to accumulate as much as possible and invest as much as you can, then indulge yourself with what you've made, a more biblical and heavenly view is to examine what you've earned, what you have, to know that it all comes from God, and then to give back to God through reaching, caring, serving those in need. Proverbs also reminds us that generous people will prosper. Those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. There's that old saying, I can never outgive God. And there's so much truth to that. So friends, I'll close with this question. What do you have that you can generously give to someone else? Amen.